the Phoenix program did not begin with gunfire. It began with paperwork, lists, and a belief that the war in Vietnam could be won not by defeating the enemy in open combat, but by dismantling the social and political fabric that allowed the insurgency to survive. The CIA believed that the Viet Cong were not simply fighters, but an invisible government woven into the villages, schools, markets, and families of South Vietnam. If the United States could identify the local leaders, tax collectors, messengers, teachers, and sympathizers, then the guerrilla movement would collapse from the inside. It was an idea that made sense on paper, but the next steps taken in its name would turn counterinsurgency into a machine of fear. To build the program, the CIA needed names. And to get names, they needed databases, interrogation centers, and an intelligence network capable of reaching into every hut, house, and marketplace in rural Vietnam. A network of provincial interrogation centers was constructed across the South, each staffed with U.S. advisors and South Vietnamese forces trained, funded, and armed by the CIA. The goal was simple: identify, capture, interrogate, and eliminate the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. But this goal came with one problem in most villages: no one knew who was actually Viet Cong and who was not. Any accusation could end a life. The CIA built the blacklists, ranking suspects in order of importance. District chiefs were told to fill those lists quickly, and because promotions and reputation depended on results, the lists grew fast and often without evidence. Informants, neighbors, business rivals, and local officials could accuse almost anyone: a teacher who questioned the government, a farmer who refused taxes, a village elder who had the wrong cousin. In a system where confessions were extracted under torture, and intelligence was measured in names and body counts, the truth mattered far less than the numbers. Helicopters landed in villages without warning, troops kicked in doors, and civilians were pulled from their beds in front of terrified families. If they were lucky, they disappeared into interrogation centers. If not, their bodies were left in canals, rice paddies, or the jungle, classified as neutralized. The CIA used a clean bureaucratic word to describe what was, in reality, assassination. In a system designed for efficiency, morality was an inconvenience. Inside the interrogation centers, the methods were calculated, practiced, and refined. Former operatives described electric shocks applied to ears, fingers, and genitals, waterboarding long before the term entered American vocabulary, suspension by ropes, sleep deprivation, starvation, forced positions, beatings, leg clamps, and psychological torture designed to break the human mind before the human body. Some interrogators admitted that they did not want confessions, they wanted names. Each new name meant a new target. Each new target meant progress, and progress meant survival in a system where careers were advanced by blood. The CIA claimed these were necessary measures, controlled and limited, designed to dismantle a ruthless insurgency. But memos and testimony paint a different picture. Advisors sent warnings to Washington that the system rewarded killing over intelligence, that many of the dead were not Viet Cong at all, that the program was becoming a political assassination machine. When congressional investigators asked how many of the so-called neutralized insurgents were actually captured, interrogated, and jailed rather than killed, the answer was a number that sent shock through the room. The majority never made it to a cell. They were executed in the field. Official reports tried to present precision and order, charts, graphs, targets, and strategic goals, but soldiers who served in the villages admitted that on the ground, Phoenix looked less like counterinsurgency and more like terror. One Marine intelligence officer later said that Phoenix was a sterile statistical cover for murder. Another called it industrial-scale killing. One CIA advisor testified that quotas were set for enemy body counts. District chiefs who failed to meet their numbers risked losing their positions. And in a war where the real enemy often blended into the population, the easiest targets were civilians with no power to defend themselves. The Viet Cong saw Phoenix not as intelligence warfare, but as state terrorism. Villagers learned to sleep lightly, to fear knocks at the door, to hide their children when unfamiliar helicopters passed overhead. Some families dug hiding pits beneath their floors to escape late-night arrests. Entire communities learned that silence was survival, that one word, one conversation, one overheard complaint could mean disappearance. In many areas, the United States was no longer viewed as a protector against communism. It was seen as the shadow in the dark. Meanwhile, Washington reviewed progress through sanitized briefings. Columns of figures explained how many suspects had been neutralized, how many districts had been cleared, how many villages had been pacified. Success was measured like a business target. The right number of kills meant the program was working. But the body count concealed something far more dangerous: rage spreading through the countryside, pushing more civilians into the arms of the insurgency. Instead of weakening the Viet Cong, Phoenix often strengthened their support. The CIA defended itself by saying that Phoenix did not require killing, that it was the South Vietnamese police and military who carried out the abuses. But this distinction was thin. The United States funded the program, trained its forces, built the interrogation centers, provided the intelligence systems, and evaluated field officers based on results. CIA advisors were present in facilities where torture was used. They signed off on operations that resulted in civilian deaths. They studied reports that detailed the brutality and kept the machine running. American personnel who objected found themselves isolated. Some were transferred, some resigned. Some years later would testify before Congress, hoping the country would confront the truth. But the war was still ongoing, and public acknowledgement of such a program would have caused political shockwaves. So officials spoke carefully. They rebranded the mission as neutralization, pacification, or counterterror. Phoenix was not a dark secret. It was simply wrapped in professional language. Even so, the rumors spread. Journalists, soldiers, and humanitarian workers began reporting what they saw: bodies in rivers, mass arrests, interrogation screams audible from outside walls, villages emptied after raids. When leaks reached the American press, the government tried to contain the damage. Officials insisted the program was lawful, targeted, and necessary. They pointed to Viet Cong atrocities, claiming that Phoenix merely mirrored the enemy's methods. But as more evidence surfaced, the official narrative began to crack. Congress eventually launched investigations. Witnesses described beatings, electric torture, rape, and summary executions. One former advisor testified that Phoenix had become a computerized death list. Another admitted that innocent civilians had been killed in large numbers. The hearings generated headlines, but not accountability. No high-level official faced charges. The intelligence officers who designed the system kept their careers. The files were classified, sealed, and absorbed into the history of covert warfare. When the Vietnam War ended, the story of Phoenix did not disappear. It evolved. Tactics pioneered in Vietnam, targeted killings, intelligence fusion centers, psychological warfare, black site interrogations, resurfaced in later conflicts. Afghanistan, Iraq, Latin America, Africa. Counterterrorism doctrines around the world carried fingerprints of a program that officially ended but never truly died. Today, Vietnam has monuments to the victims, memorials in villages where families lost sons, daughters, and parents to a war fought in the shadows. Survivors still remember the sound of helicopters, the fear of being named, the sense that death could arrive not from the enemy, but from the sky wearing an ally's uniform. In the United States, the Phoenix program occupies a gray space in historical memory, acknowledged yet minimized, discussed yet rarely confronted with full honesty. But the story matters because it forces a deeper question about war. At what point does strategy become immorality? When a nation decides that efficiency justifies brutality, when human life becomes a statistic on a chart, when lists determine who lives and who dies, the line between defense and atrocity becomes indistinguishable. The Phoenix program teaches that atrocities do not require hatred. They require only a system that rewards results and punishes hesitation. A system where no one questions the numbers as long as the numbers look good. A system where language sanitizes violence until the violence seems reasonable. History remembers the battles of Vietnam, Hue, Khe Sanh, Ia Drang. But the Phoenix program was a different kind of battle. One fought in prison cells and village huts. One measured not by territory gained, but by lives taken. One that did not just aim to defeat an enemy, but to reshape an entire population through fear. And in the end, it raises a truth that intelligence reports could never quantify. If counterinsurgency destroys the trust of the people, then the war is already lost. The shocking reality of the Phoenix program was that its brutality did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from structure, planning, and bureaucracy. Every raid, every arrest, every interrogation, and every killing had paperwork, reporting channels, and approval systems. Violence was not a breakdown of command. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Cold efficiency disguised as national security. The command hierarchy flowed downward from CIA headquarters through the Saigon station, into region and district centers, and finally into village-level operations. At every level, officers faced pressure to produce measurable results. And because body counts could be tallied, quantified, and displayed in neat columns, they became the preferred metric. Intelligence gathering, community stabilization, analysis, those took time. Killing was faster. The system incentivized speed over accuracy. This logic mirrored the broader war. America measured progress in Vietnam not by territory secured, not by hearts and minds won, but by how many enemy combatants were eliminated. The Phoenix program distilled that logic into its purest form, counterinsurgency as body count management. The consequence was predictable. The threshold of who counted as enemy slid downward until the line between insurgent and civilian dissolved. Former CIA operatives testified years later that they warned superiors repeatedly that Phoenix was drifting into political cleansing, but the pressure was overwhelming. District officers were told that insufficient numbers signaled incompetence, or worse, sympathy with the enemy. Careers rose or fell based on how many suspected Viet Cong they could neutralize. In such an environment, hesitation became professional suicide. And the villagers trapped between the Viet Cong and the US-backed South Vietnamese state suffered the cost. Behind every raid was a network of informants. Some were paid, some were coerced, some were criminals offered freedom in exchange for names. Many used the system to settle personal scores, eliminate rivals, or remove troublesome neighbors. In a perfect intelligence environment, such abuse could be filtered out. But Vietnam was not perfect. It was fragmented, terrified, and dependent on rapid results. Informants were rarely challenged. Their accusations translated into raids. Raids produced arrests. Arrests produced interrogations. And interrogations under torture produced more names. The machine fed itself. Provincial Interrogation Centers, or PICs, were the core of this machine. Built with U.S. funds and staffed by South Vietnamese forces advised by CIA officers, these centers operated in a gray zone outside conventional military oversight. Inside, the boundaries of acceptable conduct evaporated. Interrogators worked to extract names, networks, routes, sympathizers, caches, couriers, political organizers, anything that could expand the intelligence net. Interrogation logs showed that prisoners were not evaluated for guilt or innocence. They were evaluated for utility. The goal was not justice. It was operational flow. Prisoners who provided names lived. Prisoners who refused became useless. And in the Phoenix program, useless had a terminal meaning. Testimony from military police assigned to guard some of these centers reveals a stark pattern. Interrogators worked in shifts around the clock, determined to break prisoners quickly. Victims were water tortured, held upside down in tanks, shocked with field telephones, beaten with rifle butts, starved, threatened with family harm, or suspended from beams for hours. When they broke, they signed confessions, whether true or not, and the net widened once again. Even the paperwork reinforced brutality. Standardized report forms allowed for 3 outcome categories: killed, captured, rallied. Rallied referred to suspects who defected, confessed, and agreed to cooperate. In practice, the first 2 categories dominated. Capturing a suspect required transport, interrogation space, logistics, food, guards, and reporting follow-up. Killing required none of that. Death closed the case instantly. This is why critics later described Phoenix not as an intelligence program, but as systematic assassination. The system rewarded killing more than thinking. Eliminating an individual was easier than understanding their role. And because the metrics flowed upward, district chiefs reporting to province chiefs to region commands to CIA headquarters, every body became a data point in a column labeled success. Meanwhile, American command staff were faced with the harsh reality that, outside major cities, insurgents often held more legitimacy than the US-backed government. The Viet Cong provided shadow courts, medical care, land reform, education, and protection, things the rural population needed. Rather than out-governing the enemy, Phoenix attempted to out-terrorize them. Some US officials argued that Phoenix was necessary, that the Viet Cong themselves executed village chiefs, teachers, and police officers to destroy government influence. They pointed out that the Viet Cong assassinated over 1,000 South Vietnamese officials per year, and that counterterror was the only language the insurgency understood. This narrative remained the official US justification. But morality aside, even on strategic grounds, the program backfired. Villages that were not initially committed to the Viet Cong became radicalized by grief, anger, and humiliation. When fathers disappeared, sons picked up rifles. When mothers were beaten to extract information, daughters became couriers. For every civilian killed in error, the Viet Cong gained sympathy, recruits, and resolve. In short, Phoenix often did the enemy's recruitment for them. By the late 1960s, the program's scale had become staggering. CIA records show that over 26,000 suspected VC were killed, and more than 80,000 were detained, though even these numbers remain disputed, with some estimates significantly higher. Internal memos, declassified decades later, admitted that a large percentage of those killed were likely non-combatants. Some US advisors attempted reforms. They argued for better evidence standards, more oversight, and procedural checks. But to increase accuracy would mean slowing the pace, and Washington did not want slower results. The war was turning publicly disastrous. Leaders needed statistics that could be placed in briefings to demonstrate progress. Phoenix delivered numbers. Whether those numbers represented enemy losses or civilian casualties was a detail easily lost in translation. And then came the leaks. Journalists began reporting what they witnessed: torture chambers, death squads, mass arrests, civilian executions. The reports were initially dismissed as anti-war propaganda, but then former Phoenix officers began speaking out. They described operations with chilling detachment, explaining how kill lists were compiled, how raids were executed, how interrogations were conducted. Their testimony aligned with captured documents, journalists, accounts, and survivor statements. Congress eventually opened hearings. Before the cameras, hardened intelligence officers testified in calm, professional tones about electric torture, routine executions, falsified reports, and civilians caught in the dragnet. The public was stunned not just by the allegations, but by how openly the witnesses described them. These were not rogue agents. They were professionals describing standard procedure. One congressman famously asked a Phoenix coordinator, "Is this a program of assassination?" The officer paused, then replied, "No, sir, it is a program of neutralization." The room went silent. Neutralization, a word that meant everything and nothing. A word that allowed government officials to discuss killing as if they were discussing tax adjustments. Euphemism replacing accountability. Even as the hearings unfolded, Defenders continued to argue that Phoenix was misrepresented. They claimed that abuses were the responsibility of South Vietnamese partners, not U.S. personnel. But internal reports contradicted that narrative. American advisors watched interrogations, participated in planning, and signed off on operations. The United States was not a distant funder, it was the architect. As the war ended, the program was renamed, restructured, and absorbed into other counterinsurgency frameworks. Files were sealed, careers continued. No high-level official was prosecuted. And in the years that followed, analysts who studied Phoenix noticed an important trend. The program never truly ended. It evolved. Its tactics reappeared in Cold War proxy conflicts, Latin American counterinsurgency campaigns, the war on drugs, the war on terror, CIA black sites, targeted assassination programs, and targeted kill lists. Military academies, intelligence colleges, and special operations training courses continued to dissect Phoenix, not as a scandal, but as a blueprint. Case studies emphasized intelligence fusion centers, rapid targeting cycles, and joint command structures. The darker components, torture, civilian deaths, lack of oversight, were often omitted or downplayed in academic summaries. But for the Vietnamese civilians who lived through Phoenix, the memory is clearer. Villagers remember the midnight raids, the helicopter noise, the sudden arrests, the fear, the lists, the interrogations, the knowledge that the war had come inside their homes not as open battle but as quiet terror. Traveling today through rural Vietnam, memorial stones mark villages where families were wiped out, where suspects were killed without trial, where PIC facilities once operated. Survivors speak not with hatred, but with the haunted tone of people who lived through a conflict waged not on battlefields, but in the spaces families should be safest. Even Vietnamese veterans with no love for the Viet Cong admit that Phoenix spread fear indiscriminately. It damaged communities, deepened resentment, and convinced many that the US-backed government was not a protector, but a threat. The Phoenix program forces difficult historical questions. How far should a nation go in combating an insurgency? Can atrocity ever be justified by strategy? What happens when a democratic government adopts the methods of the enemy it claims to oppose? The documents, testimonies, and statistics provide one answer. When brutality becomes systemic, data replaces morality. When kill counts become performance indicators, war ceases to be about victory, it becomes about numbers. And numbers, unlike people, never scream. The legacy of the Phoenix program is not only in the bodies left behind, the villages shattered, or the files sealed in archives. Its legacy is the realization that modern war does not always require armies, bombs, or battlefields. Sometimes it requires desks, filing cabinets, and spreadsheets. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is not a rifle, but a pen signing a name onto a list. And perhaps the most sobering realization is that Phoenix did not represent a failure of American intelligence. It represented intelligence functioning according to the priorities of the system: fast, efficient, quantifiable, brutal. A machine designed to eliminate a threat, even if the machine could not always remember what the threat looked like. Conflict experts looking back at Phoenix often argue that the program teaches a lesson that policymakers rarely want to hear. You cannot kill your way out of a political problem. If the population distrusts the government, killing them will not restore trust. If the insurgency has roots in inequality, eliminating organizers does not eliminate injustice. War may destroy the body, but legitimacy lives in the mind. And when counterinsurgency abandons legitimacy, its defeat becomes inevitable, even if the spreadsheets report success. Decades later, when U.S. leaders examined the failures of modern wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, widespread corruption in allied governments, civilian casualties fueling insurgency recruitment, and intelligence targets selected on incomplete data, scholars pointed to an uncomfortable observation. We have seen this before. The structures, philosophies, and intelligence cycles bore the fingerprints of Phoenix. New names, new regions, new enemies, the same strategic blind spot, believing that killing enough people could solve a political problem that killing had helped create. But if there is one lesson the Phoenix program delivers louder than any statistic, testimony, or congressional report, it is this. When war abandons its moral boundaries, the war does not merely change, the nation fighting it changes as well.